On today's episode of Locked On Wild, 3 things to take away from the Wild's win against the Columbus Blue Jackets, including Filip Gustavsson making both the easy and the difficult saves and putting in a little extra time on the ice.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we hear from John Hynes on a few things that he liked after the 3-1 win over Columbus. We'll talk about Filip Gustavsson's continued excellent play. Being able to add to a lead, that's going to be, I think, the key one that we discuss here in today's show. And we'll also talk about just why Kirill Kaprizov is as good as he is. Well, has a lot to do with the work that he puts in on the ice. So all that coming up here today. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021, credentialed media member, and we've got 2 episodes coming up here for you, as we'll also be talking with Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers to get a little intel ahead of tonight's matchup against the Florida Panthers. But the Wild won Saturday's game against the Blue Jackets 3-1. Had a chance to watch, but was with family, so didn't have a chance to do all of our normal post-game, but wanted to still get you those 3 keys from that win against the Blue Jackets, because I thought John Hynes had some interesting things to say and actually found some numbers that are just going to blow you away in regards to a few of the things that he talked about. But let's start with the guy who has just continued to roll in Filip Gustavsson. And here's what John Hynes had to say about his performance in that win.
Gustavsson obviously gets a lot of attention this week for the goal, but the play in his own net, John, has been pretty impressive too.
Yeah, he's been really solid. I think that, that's what we need. He's making the saves that you need to make. There's, he looks real solid in there. I think he's seeing the puck through traffic. His rebound control strong, and that's what you need from him. And then he's making saves. So you're going to have breakdowns in the game. I think when you have the combination of making the routine saves all the time, and then you're making the big saves when you need one, that's where his game's at.
Yeah, that's spot on from John Hynes, and that's something that this Wild goalie tandem didn't do a ton of last year. Is it seemed like there were so many instances in which, whether it be either Marc-Andre Fleury or Filip Gustavsson, where the first goal given up was one that you look at and you say, boy, your goalie's got to make that save. Well, this season, Filip Gustavsson has done a really good job of making all of those, I don't want to say easy saves, but the key saves, the ones that you expect your goalie to make, while also making some really highlight level saves in there as well. But I want to key in on one big one, because this was something that I talked about with Alex yesterday a little bit, but I want to really go into more detail on. There was, I believe it was on the power play, and Filip Gustavsson was in net. And the Columbus Blue Jackets tried to do the exact same thing that the Seattle Kraken did to Marc-Andre Fleury, where Jordan Eberle sneaks around to the backside of the net. Nobody even remotely close to him to be able to try to interfere. And they just try for a pass and a backdoor tap in. Now, obviously, that Eberle goal, there was some question as to whether or not that was kicked or was a kicking motion. But the point still stands in that the Columbus Blue Jackets tried to see if the Minnesota Wild learned from what happened against Seattle. And Filip Gustavsson did. He got his pad down and was able to wall off that part of the net and prevent what could have been a goal that gets snuck by him to make that game a little closer than it was at that point. And so I give a lot of credit to Filip Gustavsson for being able to make that save and to not let that become a repeat problem in the pipes, because that could very well have been a goal that, all of a sudden you turn that into, I think at that point it would have been a 2-2 game or would have been 2-1. So it ends up being a little closer than what was, what the initial score of that game. And so kudos to Filip Gustavsson for seeing what happened in that game against Seattle and saying, I'm going to ensure that this doesn't happen to us again. But some of the other numbers, Brett Marshall keyed in on this, friend of the show now with the Soda Pod. Filip Gustavsson has stopped all of the high danger attempts that he's faced this year. He is 22 of 22 in the high danger chances. And some of the goals that he has given up, you may look at and say, yeah, you'd like your goalie to make the save there. But they're happening in like the third period as opposed to happening right away in the game. And so Gustavsson has done a great job this year of being able to keep the opponent off the board and be able to give the Minnesota Wild an opportunity to try to take that early lead, something that we'll talk about here coming up in a second. But it is a great combination of Gustavsson making all the key saves, but also making all the required saves, I think is probably the best way to put that. And it should be no surprise that Gus is leading or is in amongst the top 10 in goals against average and save percentage. And it led to him being named the third star of the week for the NHL for his efforts in those games against both the Columbus Blue Jackets and the St. Louis Blues. And so Filip Gustavsson, I'm really, really happy that he took what happened last year to heart. And let's be honest here. It was a couple of months of the season that really buoyed his numbers. It was a couple of bad months of the season that led to his numbers being where they were. He had some really good months for the Minnesota Wild last season. And so the Filip Gustavsson that we saw a couple of years ago, where he was one of the sneaky favorites to win the Vezina, we still saw some flashes of that guy last season. There just were a couple of months that did not go well, that led to his numbers being where they were. And now this season, he has just been lights out from the get-go. And so some early hardware for Filip Gustavsson, third star of the week for a couple of really good saves. Missed out on the shutout both times, but he scored one fewer goal than he allowed over the last two games. And so he's been great. And I think John Hynes is right that it comes down to being able to make those key saves late in games, penalty kill, even extra attacker late, being able to make those key saves, but also making the ones that give the Wild the opportunity to take the early lead, because it turns out Minnesota Wild are night and day if they get the early lead or if they fall behind early. Those two things make a very big difference as to how the Minnesota Wild's season goes. And so we'll take a look at the notion of getting the early lead as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. The Minnesota Wild taking on the Florida Panthers in action here tonight. And the Panthers come in as 1.5 goal favorites. They're plus 168 on the 1.5 goal money line. Minnesota Wild are plus 126 in this game. The over of 5.5 is minus 128 as well. So FanDuel expecting some goals to be scored in this one. And so you can, maybe you feel like rolling with the Wild to cover the 1.5 goal spread at minus 205. So we'll see what happens. But if you do place a bet on the Minnesota Wild, or even if you place a bet on the Florida Panthers, you can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Doesn't have to be a winner. It's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So head to FanDuel.com right now to take advantage of this great offer. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For those that were looking for the live show last night, Denny had some internet issues at his apartment, and so we opted to move to Wednesday just to make sure that those get ironed out. Would rather have everything fully taken care of than try to kind of gut through it. So Wednesday night at 8 p.m. will be our next live edition of Locked On Wild. We'll also have you covered after the game tonight with our usual Locked On Wild postcast. So join us once the action is done, and 5:30 p.m. Central Time start tonight. Love that. So we'll be done with the postcast in plenty of time for those that have to get up a little early on the work side. So join us for another Locked On Wild postcast after tonight's game against the Panthers. So we talked about Filip Gustavsson making the key saves and making the saves that you need your goalies to make. Another key to the start for the Minnesota Wild has been getting the early lead. And so let's get John Hynes' thoughts on getting the early lead and building off of it over the first 5 games of the season.
What would you attribute to the fact the team hasn't trailed in any of these periods, in any of these games? You get a lead, you build it, hold on to it. Just what are you seeing that's enabled that to happen?
I don't think there's any one common theme. To be honest, I think it's that even if we've gotten off to some, we have maybe had the best first periods or whatever, we're getting saves when you need them. And then we're able to capitalize when we have the opportunities. And, I think that's been the recipe. It hasn't really been anything that I'd say we've done. I think it's how the games have played out.
Yeah, and you look at the numbers for the Minnesota Wild over the course of last season, which it felt like it was an issue all year for the Minnesota Wild. Just looking at the statistics, the Minnesota Wild were 38-5 when they scored first last year. When the opponent scored first, 9-25-5. And you look at it after one period, when the Minnesota Wild led, they were 24-4. When they trailed, they were 4-21-5. When they led after 2, 25-2-3. When they trailed after 2, 4-25-3. And when they were tied after 1, 11-8-5. When they were tied after 2, they were 10-6-4. And I think this is, I honestly, I wasn't surprised by these numbers. And I'll say what I mentioned in yesterday's show for the Everydayers. You heard me mention this. Saying that the Wild have not trailed for any amount of time through the first few games of the season, it sounds really fun to say. The clock stopped when the Wild lost to the Kraken in overtime, or when they lost to the Jets in overtime, and the shootout is untimed. So at the end of the day, it's a 3-2 start for the Minnesota Wild. But I think the important thing is that the Wild are just a team that is much more built to be able to get an early lead and hold it than they are to try to come back from a 1 or a 2 goal deficit. And part of this stems, I think, from just the amount of time it happened early on last year. I charted the numbers of games in which Filip Gustavsson was in net for the Wild. the Wild trailed 20 times when Filip Gustavsson was in net. And their record in those games was 6-12-2. In 23 games with Filip Gustavsson in the net as the starter. Now, there were a few games where he got pulled, and so he didn't factor in the decision. But the Minnesota Wild's overall record in those games, 17-5-1 when the Wild got the first goal. And so you see just this massive disparity in how this team plays, because I think it allows them to exert more pressure offensively and to really try to just keep pushing against their opponents. I think this has also, you look at the number of times early on in the season last year, the Wild did not trail in either of the first two games after the first goal. Obviously, they beat Florida 2-0. They lost to Toronto 7-4. But then look at this. They allowed the first goal to Columbus, Edmonton, Philly, New Jersey, New York, Buffalo. And so that's 6 straight games right there with Filip Gustavsson in the net. Then they didn't trail to Ottawa. They still lost that game. But then they gave up the first goal to Colorado and Detroit. With John Hynes, it got way better. They did not give up the first goal to St. Louis, Nashville, Calgary. They did to Vancouver. And then Seattle, Calgary, and Vancouver, they got the first goal in all of those games. I think it's just there's a psyche angle to this as well, especially with how the season started for this Minnesota Wild team. Giving up the first goal, especially early on, and you just in your heads are like, here we go again. Like, we're going to have to dig out of this hole and hope that the other team doesn't get another goal to be able to, pad the lead and turn it into all of a sudden a 2-0 deficit or a 3-0 deficit. You look at the goals numbers for the Minnesota Wild last year. They got outscored in the first period 77-68. And so they were -9 in the first period. They outscored their opponents 78-69 in the second period. So it's pretty close spreads in periods 1 and 2. So they are net even through the first two periods. And then in the third, opponents outscored the Minnesota Wild 107-98 last year. Now at home, the Wilds were even in the first. They were +2 in the second. They were -5 in the third. But on the road, the Wild were -9 in the goals department in the first period. And that you just can't do as the road team. You got to go into a road game and you got to try to steal momentum. You got to try to get the crowd quiet. And the Wild did not consistently do that last year, despite outshooting their opponents in the first period, which that's not a huge indicator of overall success. It just depends on who's in net that night or who's not playing for the opponent. But I think a lot of this speaks to just the mentality of this team, and I hope it's an understanding that this team is not really built to come back from deficits like they were a couple of years ago when it didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were down by 1, down by 2. They were going to be able to stem those deficits. Now, if you look at 2 years ago, 2022, 2023, the Wilds were -3 in the first period, but then they were a +12 in the second and a +11 in the third. So they did a good job of being able to push teams out in the second and the third periods, especially on the road. Like +3 in the first, even in the second, +9 in the third period for the Minnesota Wild. Now, if we go to 2021, 2022, they were plus $1 billion. The Wild outscored their opponents 93-76 in the first, 100-80 in the second, and 101-90 in the third, and then in overtime, 11-3. Large goal disparity, but that's how that team was built. Team is not built this way over the last couple of seasons. And so the goalies being able to keep the Wilds in it is a huge reason as to why the Wild have been able to get off to the starts that they have. Now, Kirill Kaprizov had a pretty nasty goal from the face-off circle from an angle that not a lot of people are able to score from. And John Hynes had some thoughts about that as well. This is nothing new, but I think it is something that is a little different from last season in the Wild putting in additional time to get themselves ready for the year. We'll talk about that as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven for the search for better. When it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Plus, listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility on Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. One final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we've got 2 episodes for you today. Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers, kind enough to join us for a crossover in which we talk about how the Florida Panthers celebrated the Stanley Cup and how they have navigated the early part of the season so far. So make sure to check that episode out as well here on Locked On Wild. All right, let's get to the final nugget from the postgame against the Columbus Blue Jackets. And John Hynes was asked about Kirill Kaprizov's ability to score from pretty much anywhere on the ice. And Kirill Kaprizov's really good. We know that. But a lot of the work that he is able to put in to put himself in those positions comes from extra time after practice.
You feel pretty good when Kirill can one-time it from that right circle. He seems to love that shot.
Yeah, that's not many guys can do that, and that far out too, outside the dot over there. But I think he's always working on that stuff, 30 to 40 minutes after practice, and that's why he's a great player, because he puts the work in. He knows areas where he can get to, and he has such a high skill level. He can execute those plays, but it's not just because he's a talented player. It's because he works and puts the time in those areas that he knows he's going to get pucks in, and he can score.
And this is something that, I'm not going to heap praise on the Wild for, putting in extra time. It is nice to hear about, considering some of the things that happened last year where you heard about just, not a lot of practice time being put in, or, things would be an issue way into the season. And it's like, well, gee, if they maybe would have practiced here and there, that would have led to different results. But that was something that was definitely a focus for John Hynes this year in training camp, was putting together a strenuous and aggressive training camp to get everybody ready for the start of the season. And it was interesting too. And I didn't end up clipping this highlight, but also talked about the fact that the Wild didn't do a team bonding trip before the season started this year. And John Hynes said, some of that was because the team is going to spend so many games on the road, but Also wanted to make sure that everybody was ready to go from the drop and ready to get the season started and ready to get off to a better start than the Wild did last season. And so some of that stuff is nice to hear because I think everybody knew coming into this year that a repeat was just flat out not acceptable. And that was going to lead to some big changes for not only the team, but probably other areas as well. And so it is nice to see that being taken more seriously. And as a result, 3-0-2, or as I like to say, 3-2 through the first 5 games. But as was pointed out in the comments, it's been against teams that you expect to be able to beat. Columbus twice. You should win those games both. The Wild did in regulation both times, so they got 4 out of 4 there. That game against Seattle is really the only one that still kind of sits funny with me because, as we have seen all season, the Wild get out to the early lead. But every time the Wild would get a separator goal, the Kraken come right back. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're tied going into overtime. You go through overtime, and then you lose one in the shootout. So that feels like a point that was let go. But the Winnipeg game, great battle, considering that the Wild were coming into that game on the second night of a back-to-back, had played heavy minutes to even get the point against Seattle. And so there were a lot of tired legs in that game against Winnipeg. But still, that's a point secured. You beat the Blues. You beat the Columbus Blue Jackets again. And so to this point, the Wild have, for the most part, beaten the teams that you'd expect. And they have 2 of a possible 4 points against potential playoff teams. Well, if you count the St. Louis Blues in there, you've got 4 out of 6. So early part of the season, the Wild have been doing what they need to do. But as we talked about yesterday with Alex, the everydayers know exactly what I'm talking about here. This now is a full measuring stick week. You got the Florida Panthers coming up. You've got the Tampa Bay Lightning. You've got the Philadelphia Flyers, who are off to a rough start, but they were right in the mix for a postseason spot last year. And a noon start is weird on a Saturday. So those are going to be full tests. And then you got Pittsburgh, and you've got Pittsburgh after that. I thought for some reason there was another game in there, but it's Philadelphia and then it's Pittsburgh. So it's a tough little 4-game swing on the road here. And so the Wild, if they continue to do what they've done so far this year, which is to get out to the early lead, get key saves from the goalies, and to be able to extend the lead and not fall into some of the traps that led to the losses last year, well, then they should be able to handle it. But it is interesting to hear some of these things after the games that they're winning, as opposed to some of the games that just are not going well for this team so far. So a lot of it so far stems from Filip Gustavsson being absolutely lights out to start the season. And the Wild have been able to bank points while he has been in rare prime form. Can you do it against the big dogs? Can you do it against the playoff caliber teams consistently? Something that the Wild did not do, especially against the Central last year. That's the big test. That's the big measuring stick. That will determine how this team does for the rest of the season. So it's going to be a fun week. It's going to be a big week for the Minnesota Wild. Looking forward to keeping everybody up to date every step of the way here this week. So thank you for everybody tuning in to today's bonus episode of Locked On Wild. Again, make sure to hit that like button so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Locked On Wild has you covered every Monday through Friday, plus pre and post game coverage as well, with new episodes as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.